All right, well, hey, long time no see, you guys. So today I'm going to be doing the justice system and why victims choose silence. So we're going to start with what the justice system is, the justice system in Christianity, what a victim is, a victim's rights, my interview that I had the chance to do with the Anderson County Sheriff, Chad McBride, the Christian mindset on the justice system and victims, what you should know before reporting, my own personal experience, and then we're going to conclude. The justice system. The criminal justice system is a system of law enforcement that is directly involved in apprehending, prosecuting, defending, sentencing, and punishing those who are suspected or convicted of criminal offenses. In other words, it's established by government to control crime and impose penalties on those that violate crime. There is no single criminal justice system in the United States, but rather many similar individual systems. How the criminal justice system works in each area depends on the jurisdiction that is in charge, whether that is city, county, state, federal, tribal government, or military installation. The main systems are state and federal. State criminal justice systems handle crime committed within their state boundary, while the federal criminal justice system handles crimes committed on the federal property or in more than one state. Justice system in Christianity. Laws are created to ensure human security, provide justice, and protect human rights. The justice system exists to ensure that everyone is acting in accordance with the law. In the event of a violation, that is a crime, the system ensures that the appropriate punishment is obtained. American laws and the justice system were formed in the very direction so that the justice system actively echoes Christian religion. Criminals can be rehabilitated and redeemed is also a significant way that it echoes Christian religions. History professor Philip Jenkins justified how religion and church also played a significant role in reducing punishment and cruelty. Faith is a major influence on the establishment of generally accepted ethical standards, which also regulate the activities of the justice system itself. For instance, the police have their ethical code for behavior with the arrest, and the prisons have their own about punishing prisoners. Thus, Christianity became the basis both for the creation of the justice system and for the establishment of its principles of functioning, and that the justice system reflects the Christian defense of humans. Christianity initially assumes the existence of specific laws and rights, natural law and rights, and when people tend to secularize and depart from religiosity, the influence of established morality is felt in society. Natural laws and rights are inspired by Christian concepts. The idea of specific rules that society should follow, punishments for disobedience, and the possibility of redemption have become the basis of justice system. Concepts, in return, represent the natural law and rights granted by God to people. What is a victim? Whether a person is a victim of a criminal offense or a victim of abuse of power, the justice system should make the person or persons feel like a priority. A victim is a person who individually or collectively have suffered harm, including physical or mental injury, emotional suffering, economic loss, or substantial impairment of their fundamental rights through acts or omissions that are in violation of criminal laws operative within member states. Victims should be granted access to the necessary material, medical, psychological, and social assistance through governmental, voluntary, community-based, and indigenous means. Health services should be accessible, and personnel that directly work alongside these victims should obtain specific training to better ensure proper and prompt aid to those who have been afflicted with physical and mental injuries. These include, but are not limited to, police, health services, and the social service systems. What does a victim look like? Oftentimes we have in our mind what we think a person of a victim would look like or what category they fit into. And I want to remind you that no matter economic status, race, gender, or age, or any level of crime, anyone can be a victim at any point in time, especially when you least expect it. Victim blaming. When a victim of a crime or harmful act is held responsible for what happened to them. The issue with this is it can lead to the victim feeling shame or self-blame, and it can also shift the focus away from the perpetrator and their actions. And not only we don't realize it, but we're beating someone while they're already down, when what we should do is build a community around the person who is needing more help than ever. As Christians, we need to be aware of victim blaming and speak out against it when seen happening. It's extremely important to hold perpetrators accountable for their actions and to support victims in their healing process. Oftentimes, victims of a criminal offense find themselves being treated less as a human being and more as mere evidence. These victims are left out of criminal proceedings that could alter their entire well-being and change the course of their life, gaining little confidence in the system and little hope for justice. Lawrence Bagwell, trial attorney from New York, sees firsthand the undeniable suffocation and the continual traumatic cycle the criminal justice system has created. Even now, in the 20th century, victims of crime lack the formal legal status that should be automatically granted upon reporting. The Crime Victims Rights Act, not until 2004, affords victims the right to a victim's advocate, right to restitution, and the right to speak and be present in criminal proceedings. Bagwell states, restitution is only mandated in about 1/3 of states, and it's usually limited to violent felony offenses, causing the court to make no room for losses that cannot be strictly quantified. The simple recognition of victims' rights determine whether or not they will testify at the accuser's trial and to the extent at which they will testify. If the system chooses not to recognize a victim's rights, then victims can be grinded over and over again during the trial. Advocates of victims support the inclusion of the victim's impact as an evidence in trial. Bagwell again relays the message that pain, suffering, and psychological trauma, in many cases the most lasting harm to victims, are not accounted for in the equation. Most critics do not seem to care about the moral concerns of the victim, but rather believe that the accuser should be determined innocent or guilty only by physical evidence, not the moral or after effects the victim must deal with. A maturing neurobiology of trauma has closed the gap between psychological harm and physical damage. Brains are flexible and trauma is real. And where children are concerned, we now understand that the brain development grows around traumatic experience. A truly rational justice system demands both concern for societal health and individual lives. Progression has been made toward the compensation of physical injuries and some financial costs. However, psychological injuries are overlooked and placed in the back burner, labeled as a second thought. Pain for victims is real and is important as a system and society to acknowledge that suffering exists beyond the initial crime committed. To ensure my research remained unbiased, I reached out to Anderson County Sheriff Chad McBride and heard his thoughts on the desperate need for change within the system. And Anderson County, once elected sheriff, his first order of change was to create a better program for victims advocate, so the needs were met for victims. My first question for him was what his first order was and why it was so important. And he responded with, to create a better program for victims advocates so that needs could be better met for victims. Originally, there were only 2 victim advocates on site, and that number has now jumped to 4. And Mr. McBride agrees that it is still not enough personnel for one county. Funding, however, limits the hopes and only allows for so many advocates. The expectation for victim advocate in Anderson County is simple. Make victims feel heard, and the rule of thumb for victims advocate is to always follow up. Whether this is new information on a case or not, this even applies for all victims, individuals, or businesses, or any level of crime, to express that all victims deserve a phone call as a sign of support. It is heard more often that victim advocates in the solicitor's office are harder to reach in the 13th Circuit, and this could be caused by simply leadership culture. Even at the state level, it can be easily perceived that the system has become more pro-criminal and lazy toward helping victims. One current case, the Murdaugh trial, has brought to light some of the major issues of the judicial system as a result of being attacked by all Americans. And now, as more people bark for rights, the legislature is finally creating rights and bills to work toward some of its needed reform. And most lawyers and system workers describe our system as more of a liberal justice system similar to that of Washington State. Ideally, it would be assumed that the system of government represents the state and the people within it, which directly affect victims, criminals, and state personnel. My next question was, although the system is designed to create change, more often than not, most victims find themselves failed by the system. Can you agree with this statement? And if so, are there any examples that come to mind? He said, pretty frequent, officers will have the smoking gun that points straight toward a guilty charge, but the solicitor office turns the course towards a plea deal. Murder charges are pushed to manslaughter, which changes from 30 years to 10 years maximum. And his perfect example was Brandon Taylor, who was a notorious criminal, constantly in trouble, and at one time had 18 bonds in his record, from arrest after arrest, and then released upon bond each time, when in reality, each occurrence should have been a violation of the previous arrest. In this particular story, Brandon Taylor commits another crime, and the court decides to combine all previous accounts, but only to 1 year imprisonment sentence. After he is back and released into society, Taylor starts a relationship with a young lady in Piedmont, and as a frequent criminal and violent behavior, the relationship turned abusive. It becomes frustrating for all parties involved, especially victims of each crime that get left behind, whether numerous crimes are only acknowledged as one, and the domestic violence spanned until she sought help from her father, who, as a parent, was urged to protect his daughter. She reached out as a cry for help, and as he arrived at the apartment complex in Piedmont, he tried to confront Taylor for his abuse. In the process of fleeing, Taylor jumped into his car, a car he stole, and drives over the father, killing him. The solicitor office tries to get him to plead, and he refuses, and they eventually come back and claim that the murder is not the issue, but rather involuntary manslaughter, basically claiming reckless driving caused the accidental death, even after witnesses reported seeing Brandon Taylor aim his car toward the father and fleeing the scene right after hitting him. This horrible event occurred during COVID, and Brandon Taylor has already been released after a little under 3 years for taking another person's life. In all, over a span of 10 years of crimes, Brandon Taylor only served a little over 4 years. This father's death could have been avoided, but instead the judicial system failed this family and only left them with grief. The next question is the environment created by the justice system centered around the perpetrator rather than being more victim-friendly? He said the judicial system has groomed itself into making sure a defendant's rights have not been violated. Meanwhile, you have a victim that has been violated in some way, and the victim gets violated again on another level because the suspect has been coddled and catered to. An example is, in 2018, Chief Justice Beatty of South Carolina Supreme Court Justice decided to strip a judge's power to issue a bench warrant up to 3 times on an individual, which basically says if a defendant does not show up to an assigned court date, they can receive a letter up to 3 times saying that they have missed their court date set and are able to try again in 30 days. Funny enough, most of these defendants do not even have an address to receive these letters at. Not until 3 different letters are sent does a judge have the right to issue a bench warrant, which as a result places more concern on the defendants rather than the victim. The victim often ends up saying, especially if it's a working class person, they cannot afford to miss another day of work or even are just unable to take off the time. Then once the victim does not show up, the court case is dismissed. And defendants are given chance after chance while victims are afforded no redos, which in turn allows no room for the justice deserved. The Christian mindset on the justice system. Change is on a timer, and Christians must care enough for our culture to affect this change. Any career, especially one that directly affects the lives of others, should not be seen as merely a way to check off the boxes for the day, but instead should feel like a requirement to do good for God's will. God's plan for his people entails a calling that directly impacts others. In the criminal justice system, personnel should work to treat victims and family as God intended instead of just a case number. Entering into a career that God has designed for an individual could slowly help to reform this systematic issue. Some things you should know before reporting. Before reporting a crime that has been committed against you or a loved one, it is helpful to understand the process and prepare for the emotional ride that is ahead. The first person a victim will speak with will be a law enforcement patrol officer. Their main purpose is to collect statements and gather evidence, whether it is questioning witnesses, gathering physical evidence, photographing, or videotaping the crime scene. As a victim, although it is undoubtedly overwhelming, it is extremely important to cooperate because the beginning of the investigation can affect the entire process. Following the initial report, a reference case number will be given to allow victims to check on the status of their case. Once a crime is reported to the police, an investigation can move forward even if the victim does not wish for it to go on. Being the victim of violent crime is an emotional experience. It is not uncommon for victims and the family members of victims to change their mind about wanting to have this information go on record. A victim's advocate is assigned to each case and available to help talk through these emotions in an individual's particular case. A victim's impact statement can be represented and written or oral form, the main purpose is to process your emotions while allowing the court to feel the loss you have. And we should have clear expectations that it may take many years for a trial to be completed, and not often is a speedy trial executed as our Constitution outlines, and all victims have the right to report. Here you will see a few things that I have been told, some by people in this room, most by people in the school, as I have reported my own personal situation. September 18th, 2021, a day of events that shakes me to my very core. After recently moving to Simpsonville, South Carolina, I went about my life as any high school student would, making friends and creating memories. Unfortunately, I made the mistake of putting my trust in the hands of the wrong person. I had always heard stories of sexual assault and rape, and I always felt for the men and women who endured it. But sadly now, I find myself mourning with them, for this is my new reality, and the effects of this trauma have made their way into my everyday life. For the first year, I was forced to pretend as if nothing happened, and conceal my emotions so the school days could go smoothly. I had to sit every Monday in therapy, breaking down my walls, sharing my thoughts and emotions, and then having to rebuild those walls as I exited that small room. With guidance, I came to realize how much a trauma truly affects a person, and when diagnosed with PTSD, I was forced to accept what had changed within. Even though I was, and am still constantly being told how much of a rock star I am, and how strong I am, those words, although sweet, do nothing for the feeling I have inside. For the next week after it happened, I could barely get out of bed, or form the words to express, or even try to process what I went through. He took more than I can ever give. He broke me and left me feeling emptiness and loss of hope you would wish on no one. When I realized I needed help, I reached out for support from the justice system and even my school. Sadly, I was met with empty promises and treated as though my situation did not truly matter. I had to continue seeing him at school every day and pretending as if nothing happened and acting completely unfazed while I lived and still live with the effects of being taken advantage of. I just simply try my best to keep myself afloat, while the constant anxiety and flashbacks sometimes control my every move, and find myself associating this trauma with daily activities in my everyday life now. While I was drowning in my own thoughts and replaying the events over and over and over again in my head, no one seemed to truly care or help. I started blaming myself and wishing I could turn back time, wishing I could have seen the signs or noticed the red flags being waved right before my eyes. Also, although some expected me to sit pretty and shut up, I refused to repress my emotions and hide my story. With the support of my family, I was able to use my voice and stand up for myself. However, I can sadly say I can understand why one would choose to sit back and stay quiet. I knew for myself I could not fully begin the healing process without some form of justice. I do not seek revenge, and I do not pray for his downfall. However, I'm absolutely terrified for not only myself to experience something like this again, but my mind can't help but worry for my little sisters. Sometimes I regret coming forward because of how tedious and overwhelming the process is, not only because of the constant setbacks and the little humanity and regard I seem to be shown, not only by the school but also by the justice system, but also the constant letdown I was presented with. How unfair he received an interview before me, and not until I spoke up did they even ask for my own statement. How unfair the school allowed him to roam freely as I was treated as the issue, told I could eat lunch in another classroom and change my routes to classes. So while I was shown little sympathy from the school, I got a bad taste of that bad Christian culture we so often hear about. Connections really did alter my entire justice process and the way my administration treated me. The school seemed to act as if their hands were tied, and the system acted oblivious to his legal team as they played the system over and over again, pushing my court date a total of 5 times. I have wanted to give up on multiple occasions, but at the end of the day, I wanted to do right, not only by myself, but by my family, and show my little sisters what it truly means to stand up for myself. For the past year and a half, I have pushed through and carried myself waiting for my time. I'm absolutely drained, not only physically, but mentally and emotionally. However, I will not allow my character to be shaken, and I will not let this be what defines me, but it will be something I use to grow from. God has shown me that even in my darkest times, there is always healing and strength to be gained. I have learned sometimes we must walk alone in our own battles with only God and our family by our side. My family and I will deal with the after effects the rest of our lives and are forced to live with untrusting anxiety. I've come to understand how the juvenile system works, and I know it is mainly for the rehabilitation of minors, but it merely feels like a slap in the face to me and a tap on the wrist to him to not give the justice system justice deserved and to allow crimes and charges of these crimes to be deemed lesser. As I sit and still wait for my trial, my family, especially me, just want to move forward knowing we fought as hard as we could for justice and were given the respect and regard we deserved. I will no longer be the victim, but I will seek justice. Fairness is all I continue to beg for in the system, to put aside age and consider the best possible outcome for all that reflects on these crimes. So with that being said, no longer should others, including myself, feel as though our justice system protects the criminals over the victims. One foundation of innocent until proven guilty has become liar until proven true for victims. The justice system is supposed to be our guide and support our needs, not re-traumatize the abused, and those who have lost more than the worst can even speak for. The more our system fails to make necessary changes, the more victims choose silence, and is presented as the only reasonable option compared to being failed by our judicial system and criminal justice leaders. Thank you.
Thank you, Janna. That was great. That was brave of you. It's weird being the MC, so to speak, of stuff that like this that happens, because there are some presentations that it's tough to know what to do afterwards. And for crying out loud, y'all are supposed to go walk in a line with your college shirts on and stuff in just a few minutes. So I want to be sensitive to that as well. So I'm just gonna keep it to the adults, the panelists, and thank you all the rest of you students. I hope I don't seem like I'm being insensitive to that, but I've got a bunch of things I'm trying to juggle. And also, like these teachers, some of them had to go find subs and stuff to be here this morning, so I want to be courteous to them as well. Folks, y'all have any questions, comments to Janna?
Thank you.
I know it takes a lot to get up and talk to your peers about that. And I learned a lot from you, and I think that you are doing, I can see God working. It's very difficult, clearly, but I do see God working in and through this. For you to just even tell all of us, educate us on it, right? Because you guys are all going off to college, and so knowing what maybe some red flags and to listen to your gut, right?
Yeah.
And have a guard up, right? Because you do have to protect yourself or ourselves.
Could you please say that again?
So yeah, so really good job. But I do agree, from a personal standpoint too. A lot of you don't know this about me, but I've gone through a lot of this stuff on a personal level, and so it is broken. It's very broken, and we need more people like you to stand up and to make some changes happen. So anyways, I appreciate you,
yes,
and I know you're gonna just continue. I can tell you have a passion for this, and you're gonna do amazing things. So good job, girl.
Thank
Proud
you.
of you.
Thank you.
Kind of something that you said, like Dr. Zick said, you a lot to think about. What would you say, what pieces, 2-3 pieces of advice that you would give to anybody in this room, or your little sister's reeling for things like, she talked about, you got the red flags, or your gut, like, what would you say going forward, pieces of advice, succinctly?
I would say conversations I've had with my little sisters. Obviously, they don't know about the situation because they're too young to understand. And that's just a lot of little girls. So, but I do say when we have our conversations, I always tell them that don't feel like you have to be around someone just because your friend group is. And if you ever have that feeling that it's not right, go with it. Because majority of the time, that is not only you speaking to yourself, but it is God working through you to tell you that this is not a situation for you. And a lot of the times we worry more about the things that don't matter, like who we're friends with and what people are going to say about us and how it will affect your reputation. Who cares? We're only here for a few years, and after that, you're either in heaven or you're in hell, and that's it. So who cares what anyone in this room has to say about me, as long as he knows, I know, and my family know. That's all that matters to me. And that's all I tell them.
So again, my main concern is just being sensitive to the room. One of the things that both in your paper and in your talk that keep coming up, because where my mind goes is, like Dr. Rick said, like the system, there's just so much broken in the system, and it's impossible to point fingers at one particular group of people. Like, you made these great distinctions early on. We're not even pointing at one particular system. There's all of these different, like any state, any county is gonna have a whole different set of variables that you're working with. But one pattern that I noticed was this issue of advocates, victim advocates.
Yes.
That there's this whole office, there's this whole group of people, right? And it's cool that there's a sheriff that you talked to?
Yes.
That he sees that need, he's upped it in his department as much as he can, as much as they can afford, et cetera. Do you know, can you tell us anything about like what these victim advocates, like, does it have to be, I'm just thinking, okay, if the sheriff's department can't afford it, I understand. Are there other organizations that, like, do you have to have some type of legal license or something like that?
Well,
or
obviously you have to be a part of the system to have access to those records.
I see. Okay.
So
That
you
makes
can't.
sense.
So although you can like, okay, like I can talk to my therapist about certain issues, she doesn't know everything because she can't see my records.
Got
Your
it.
victim advocate not only helps you emotionally, but coaches you through the actual legal process.
Got it. That makes sense.
Yes,
So that's why it is a sheriff's department thing,
Mhm.
because they would have to keep that in house and
especially if it's minors, like DJJ,
totally.
which is the Department of Juvenile Justice,
Right.
which is what my situation is in.
Right.
So for that, they're even more like
Mhm.
protect the minor, protect the minor, protect the minor.
Right.
So it's like everything is so closed off.
Okay, so it's not just like, man, I wanna go start a nonprofit, be a victims advocate,
You
like
can't.
it's a whole nother.
You have to get into it, and then even sometimes the regulations are part of the issues because people get into the thing, like get into the career to be a victims advocate, and their hands are tied because of all the regulations. Like they can only do so much. And I've even spoke to a few that worked at the Anderson County, and I've spoke to one lady who tried it for 2 years, and she got so burnt out because on one hand, you have victims who aren't real victims.
Yeah.
And who are using the system just for money. And on the other hand, you have victims who truly just need some support, and you can't even provide that.
Right.
And so it's just kind of like, dang if you do, dang if you don't.
Right. So I know there are political pundits out there that wanna try to say that systemic injustice is not a thing. This is what we're talking about. It's not a problem with people not wanting to help. It's not a problem with people needing to help. There is a system that you can't point to one particular person and say, it is your fault. There is a system that is at work that's keeping people from getting the justice that they deserve. And it's not an issue of politics. Not once did you hear anything particularly political come up here, right? This is an issue of people. And seniors, I've been talking and preaching to you all year about how we as Christians need to view people as whole persons, not as statistics, not as political partisans or whatever.
My case number.
Not as a case number. Brilliant example of that. And oh, by the way, another like public compliment to you. This was a brilliant example of how that was a brilliant answer. Like, this is a wonderful example of how your passions drive your research. I'm not just giving you homework in here, people. There are problems to be solved that you got to put your mind to figure out. And this was a wonderful example of that. I hate this, but I'm afraid that we're running super low on time. I've already seen some of my people have to leave, so let's give Janna another round of applause. And I also want to give my seniors a moment to, if you want to get to it later, that's fine, but if you want to go ahead and give your feedback, go ahead and do that now.
Good girl.
Good. I'm so sweaty. I'm so nervous.